The courtyard earth, usually beaten hard and dry by the relentless Louisiana sun, had been disturbed. It was a patch perhaps 8 feet long and 3 feet wide, just off-center from the main path leading to the entrance of Thornwood, looking less like disturbed soil and more like a fresh, ugly scar etched into the plantation's tired face. The mound was low, hastily tamped down, but impossible to ignore, smelling faintly of turned clay and something acridly metallic, something that might have been spilled whiskey, or perhaps something far worse. Elias Thorne was below that soil. He was not dead, not yet, but he was certainly entombed. His wife, Delilah Thorne, had personally overseen every shovelful, every heavy stamp of the heel that cemented his dread repose. It was not a decent burial. It was a hasty, furious act of necessary atrocity, a monumental final rejection of the man who had traded the life of their 6-year-old son for the speculative price of preserved corn and salted hog bellies. The air hung thick and stagnant, heavy with the oppressive heat of the summer of 1849, a heat that promised fever and rot. Every sound seemed magnified. The distant, ceaseless drone of insects in the cane fields, the nervous shuffle of Charity's bare feet inside the shadowed hallway, and the sickeningly wet sound of Delilah dragging the heavy iron garden roller across the loose earth one last time, sealing her husband's fate with the indifference of a farmer tending a stubborn patch of weeds. Elias Thorne was a man consumed by avarice, masquerading as foresight. For months, news had trickled down the river, ominous whispers of failing yields further north, of plagues among the livestock, of a looming famine that would grip the entire region. While other planters prayed for rain and rationed their existing stores fairly, Elias saw opportunity. He had not merely stored his winter provisions, he had barricaded them, sealing the deep stone pantry and the main house cellar with newly reinforced locks, convinced that if his stores survived, he could sell them at astronomical rates once the true starvation began. This strategic cruelty had its first and most terrible victim inside the walls of his own home, their son, Caleb. The memory of Caleb was the engine driving the monstrous work in the courtyard. Caleb, already frail from a persistent cough, had faded rapidly over 3 weeks. Elias, citing divine economy and demanding absolute adherence to his rationing schedule, which supplied barely enough coarse meal and water to keep an adult alive, let alone a growing child, had watched the boy wither. Caleb had died clutching a splintered wooden doll, his small body a skeletal testament to his father's catastrophic greed, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the ceiling as if seeking salvation that never descended. Delilah had begged, pleaded, and finally screamed. She had clawed at the locked pantry door, injuring her fingers, until the blood stained the whitewash, while Elias, citing scripture about the wisdom of stewardship and the necessity of suffering for financial salvation, had remained unmoved. He had treated the child's death not as tragedy, but as unfortunate collateral damage in a necessary economic war. That moment, the morning Delilah found Caleb cold in his cot, was the instant the dutiful, terrified plantation mistress died, and something cold, calculating, and absolutely lethal took her place. The initial tremor of suspicion had run through the enslaved population of Thornwood immediately following the funeral. A quick, unmarked affair conducted by Elias himself in the backfield, far from the church and the prying eyes of neighbors. They knew, though Elias pretended otherwise, that the boy had died of neglect, not fever. They had seen the lock on the pantry, and they had seen Delilah's eyes, not red from tears, but glassy with a terrifying absolute determination. Charity, the house slave responsible for the domestic upkeep and the general misery of watching the white family's dramas unfold, had been the closest witness to the events that followed. She had been commanded simply and without inflection to prepare the parlor for deep cleaning. This was the signal. Delilah's face had been unnaturally pale, the freckles scattered across her nose standing out starkly against her bleached skin. She had spoken with the dry, rasping authority of someone executing a verdict, not planning a chore. The opportunity had presented itself 2 nights prior, during the darkest, muggiest stretch of the night, when the heat kept most people in a sweaty, exhausted stupor. Elias, drunk on bad rye whiskey and full of self-congratulatory prophecy regarding his impending wealth, had stumbled into the main hall, complaining loudly about the loose flagstone near the courtyard fountain, the one that covered the access to the deep, dry cistern. A cistern Delilah knew had been empty and sealed for years, its stone cap having been broken and replaced by a heavy iron grate that blended seamlessly with the courtyard paving. Delilah had acted with frightening speed and precision. She had waited until Elias was in the deepest throes of his drunken slumber. The sleeping draught she had administered, a powerful concoction of laudanum and certain ground root spices, provided long ago by an old field hand for managing chronic pain, a secret she had guarded fiercely, had rendered him completely inert, heavier and more helpless than a sack of wet feed. The most difficult part, the part that required the quiet, terrified strength of 2 men, was moving him, and this is where the open loop of silence began. Delilah had enlisted the aid of Thomas and Samuel, 2 young, powerful, enslaved men from the stables, men who had known and occasionally sneaked small handfuls of hard bread to the starving boy before Elias's scrutiny became absolute. They didn't speak the purpose of their labor. Delilah only pointed. She pointed to the stone grate in the courtyard, and then she pointed to Elias's inert, bloated form. The men, their faces slick with sweat and fear, understood the silent calculus immediately. If Elias survived the coming famine, their small act of charity toward Caleb would be discovered, and the price would be flaying. If Elias vanished, Delilah would have leverage, and perhaps a temporary easing of the tyranny. Survival was a spectrum, and sometimes choosing the lesser horror meant complicity in the greater. They had pried open the grate, a grinding, terrible sound quickly muffled by heavy canvas they laid down. They lowered Elias, still deep in his drugged stupor, into the cistern's mouth. The space was tight but wide enough. It was an echoing, airless chute of rough-hewn stone, about 4 feet across and perhaps 6 feet deep, before hitting the compacted earth at the bottom. A shallow grave, but a deep, immediate imprisonment. It was when the drugs began to wane, just as the first faint, sickly orange light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, that Delilah's true cruelty manifested, and the true horror of the situation locked into place for the men watching. She had ordered them to retrieve shovels, not to reseal the grate, but to fill the cistern with earth, not rock, not heavy debris, but loose, soft soil from the vegetable patches, earth that would compress easily, earth that would smother slowly. Elias awoke, not to the shock of the fall, but to the terrifying realization of movement above him. The scrape of metal against stone and the heavy, chilling thud of dirt raining down upon his chest, his face, his open mouth. This was the pattern interrupt. Elias, the pillar of authority, the man who believed he held the reins of life and death, suddenly reduced to a scrambling, panicked animal in the dark. His muffled screams, more like guttural, desperate pleas against the invasion of soil, were the only sounds Delilah seemed to truly savor. She did not rush. She instructed Thomas and Samuel to pack the dirt tight with their feet as they poured it in, ensuring no air pockets, ensuring no quick collapse into unconsciousness. She wanted him to experience the slow, suffocating pressure, the agonizing realization of his impending doom. Now, hours later, the work was finished. The cistern was full, sealed not just by the weight of the dirt, but by the weight of the enormous circular flagstone she had forced the men to roll back over the opening, and finally, by the decorative layer of fresh soil smoothed over the top, pressed down by the heavy garden roller. In the dead silence that followed, Charity watched from the parlor door, clutching a dust rag, her knuckles white. She saw the transformation in Delilah. The woman was no longer defined by sorrow or hysteria. She was defined by grim, silent satisfaction. Charity. Delilah's voice was dry, flat, completely devoid of emotion, yet carrying the cutting weight of a whip. The court is clean. See that no one walks on that patch for the remainder of the day. Tell them the well access is being repaired. Tell them the master has taken a sudden journey to New Orleans to secure provisions. He will be gone indefinitely. The sudden journey. The lie was monumental, brazen. No one took a sudden journey in the middle of a planting season without announcement, without preparation, but Charity nodded, knowing the truth was now buried, not just physically, but deep beneath the shared, terrifying secret that bound the living to the dead and the mistress to her slaves. The real re-engagement, the truly dreadful moment of confirmation, came when Delilah stood directly over the mound, her expensive satin slipper pressing down on the fresh earth. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the soil. It was a minuscule vibration, the movement of a shoulder, a final, desperate twitch of fingers struggling against the suffocating weight. Delilah stood there for a long moment, ignoring the movement, ignoring the barely audible, pathetic whimpering sound that seemed to leak from the compacted clay. She was staring past the mound, past the courtyard, into the future of Thornwood Plantation, a future she had brutally seized control of. Elias was still breathing. Delilah had given him the gift he had given their son, a slow, measured, completely unnecessary death, fueled by calculation. She had not sought merely to kill him. She had sought to transpose Caleb's agony directly onto his father. The horror wasn't the act of murder, but the meticulous mirroring of the suffering. The final, sickening revelation for Charity, and for Thomas and Samuel, standing frozen in the shadow of the stable, was that Delilah had calculated the rate of starvation versus the rate of suffocation. Given the heat, given the limited airspace now compressed by the soil, Elias would not die quickly of lack of air. He would die slowly, suffocating on the heavy smell of damp earth and his own panic. The final hours defined by an unbearable hunger for breath. She had made sure his last, conscious thoughts would be a terrifying understanding of what their son had endured. The loop was closed. The father who starved his son to death would be buried alive by the mother, slowly starved of air in the main courtyard where all business, all life, and all cruelty of Thornwood centered. The payoff was immediate and brutal. Delilah Thorne, no longer the weeping wife, was now the absolute ruler of a house built on terror. The master was gone, but the plantation remained, suspended in a state of dreadful quietude, the very earth underfoot a constant, morbid reminder of the price of disobedience. The power structure had been violently inverted, but the tyranny had only changed hands, now residing in a woman who proved herself capable of a cold, focused malevolence far surpassing her husband's clumsy greed. But the burial was just the first, desperate measure of survival. Delilah had secured her position, but she had simultaneously created an insurmountable risk, a permanent rotting secret in the center of her domain, and 3 witnesses, Charity, Thomas, and Samuel, who knew exactly what was beneath the ground and exactly what she was capable of. The sheer implausibility of maintaining such a secret, especially in the heat, meant that Thornwood was now an edifice destined to collapse. Charity knew that the burial bought them a pause, perhaps a day or two of fearful peace, but not freedom. They had traded one hell for another, more unstable one. And if Elias was still breathing now, if the slow decay of the crime began to manifest, Delilah's control would shatter, likely taking everyone down with her. The next move, the only logical move for those who knew the truth, was escape. What Charity saw next, when the sun began to truly beat down on that fresh earth and the faint, moist warmth of the disturbed soil began to rise, confirmed that Delilah Thorne had not merely sought revenge, but had calculated the perfect, agonizing death. a death that ensured her own temporary survival and perhaps the ultimate necessity for the others to plan their impossible flight before the whole house collapsed under the unbearable weight of the secret and before the sounds from beneath. The courtyard became too loud to ignore. The plantation was quiet, but the earth was waiting to betray them all. The silence that fell upon Oak Ridge was not the silence of peace, but the dense, heavy vacuum left by a sudden, violent cessation of sound. It was the absolute quiet that follows a great weight dropping or a scream being abruptly smothered. Charity Blackwood stood on the cracked veranda, the sickly, sweet scent of magnolias and decay thick in the humid air, watching the fresh mound of clay in the center of the main courtyard. She could still feel the slight tremor through the soles of her kid leather slippers, a low, rhythmic, almost subsonic vibration, the ghost movement of a man struggling desperately against the overwhelming oppression of tons of earth, airless and suffocating. She did not look at the spot for long. Prolonged gaze risked attracting the eyes of the remaining household staff, the few souls, already broken, already mute with fear, who were forced to maintain the illusion of order while the foundations of the house crumbled around them. But her ears, sharpened by months of watching her only son, Caleb, fade to a brittle shadow, catalogued every sound. The soil, newly disturbed, was still settling, creating small, almost imperceptible pfft noises, like a body sighing under unbearable pressure. She imagined Elias down there, his frantic, privileged hands, accustomed only to the feel of fine ledger paper and horse reins, now clawing against the gritty, unforgiving clay, his lungs burning with the useless desperation of a life prematurely truncated by the very cruelty he perfected. The cruelty, that was the core, the festering wound that had finally poisoned the entire house, turning mother against father, turning the master into the buried victim. It had not been poverty that claimed Caleb Blackwood, it had been performance. Elias, the patriarch of this failing, fever-ridden tract of land, had possessed wealth enough to sustain a small village, yet he had chosen to starve his own son. This was the detail that consumed Charity, turning her fear of discovery into cold, justified righteousness. Elias had been a man obsessed with control, an architect of personalized suffering. Caleb, born sickly and frail, represented weakness, a flaw in the perfect, brutal dynasty Elias intended to establish. To Elias, denying the child sustenance was not merely punishment. It was a grand, protracted philosophical statement about the survival of the strongest. He would sit at the head of the mahogany table, carving glistening portions of cured ham and pouring rich, creamy sauces onto his plate, his eyes fixed on the small, skeletal figure of his son. He would force Caleb to sit through the entire meal, the aroma of spices and roasting meat an exquisite torture, before sending him away with a glass of brackish water and a sermon on moral fortitude. The memory of the last meal was etched into Charity's eyelids, Elias smiling thinly, presenting Caleb with a perfectly browned, glistening peach tart, only to smash it with his silver fork an inch from the boy's face, proclaiming that such richness was wasted on weak blood. It was this calculated sadism, this drawn-out spectacle of paternal betrayal that had dissolved the last vestiges of Charity's sanity and fueled the strength required to drag the unconscious Elias, drugged with laudanum, meant for her own ceaseless headache, out to the waiting trench. The knowledge of the act, however, was not Charity's alone. It was shared tacitly by the dozen enslaved persons who inhabited the periphery of the manor, their lives tied inextricably to the tyrannical rhythm of Elias's temper. They had watched Caleb starve. They knew the signs. They were themselves experts in slow deprivation, and they had certainly noticed the recent frantic activity in the courtyard, ostensibly for foundation repair, but clearly too shallow, too close to the heart of the house, and overseen by Charity with an unnatural, unwavering focus. Among them was Maeva, the cook, a woman whose hands had known the weight of flour and the weight of change since childhood. Maeva had tried. She had hidden thin slices of smoked catfish beneath Caleb's mattress, had watered down rich cream until it was nearly milk, and given it to him under the guise of an errand. But Elias had eyes everywhere, not physically, but through the pervasive dread he instilled. He had discovered Maeva's compassion, not by catching her, but by the smallest improvement in Caleb's coloring. The punishment for Maeva had been swift and public, a terrifying display of Elias's belief that kindness was the ultimate insurgency. He hadn't whipped her. Instead, he had forced Maeva to stand in the blazing sun for 3 full days, hands tied, watching the empty courtyard, while he lectured the assembled workers on the dangers of misplaced sentimentality. It was a lesson aimed not just at the enslaved, but at Charity herself. I control life and death on this plantation, even the lives I create. Now, Maeva moved through the steaming kitchen, her face a mask of practiced neutrality, but her eyes, deep and knowing, occasionally flickered toward the courtyard. She was acutely aware that the absence of Elias Blackwood was not merely a missing man. It was a vacuum of terror, an improbable crack in the seemingly impenetrable structure of oppression. She knew Charity was haunted, unstable, driven by a raw grief that mirrored the silent suffering of the entire plantation, and Maeva began to calculate. Charity's immediate concern was the lie. Elias had not simply vanished. She had crafted a meticulous narrative, a sudden, urgent summons to New Orleans regarding a disastrous shipping speculation. He left in the dead of night, requiring solitude and absolute discretion, and would not return until the affairs were settled, a time frame conveniently indeterminate. She had already ordered the servants to prepare Elias's study, locking it and covering his desk with a heavy cloth, suggesting that his papers were too sensitive to be touched. She carried the pretense of a wife worried by her husband's impulsive departure, overlaying this concern with the genuine, overwhelming sorrow of a mother who had just lost her child. The difficulty lay in the sheer physical presence of the crime. The earth was too soft. The rain, always threatening in the deep South summer, could not be relied upon to hold off. This internal monologue, the weighing of risk, the structuring of the deception, was suddenly interrupted. A sound, faint but definite, traveled up the foundation of the house and vibrated directly into Charity's heel. It was not a thrashing sound now. It was a faint, grating noise like stone grinding on stone. Elias. He might be conscious. He might be trying to move the enormous weight above him. She pictured him, perhaps having broken through the cheap wooden coffin she'd improvised, pressed against the cold clay, his mouth packed with dirt, desperately trying to articulate a scream that the soil rendered into a dull, wet sound, audible only to the paranoid ear. She needed to secure the grave, to silence the faint living proof of her monstrous act. Charity immediately called for Josiah, the stable hand, a man of imposing strength, quiet temperament, and known for his exceptional ability to handle the enormous draft horses used for heavy lifting. Josiah, a tall, silent man whose shoulders bore the weight of decades of unrewarded labor, approached her slowly, his eyes lowered. Josiah. Charity's voice was unnaturally clear, projecting the authority of the mistress, masking the tremor of the killer. The old cistern capstan. The one near the east wall. It is entirely too heavy to remain there. I require it moved, immediately. The cistern capstan was not merely heavy. It was a massive, moss-covered slab of granite, roughly 6 feet square, easily weighing a ton. It was supposed to cover a dry well, but it had sat unused for years. "Ma'am, that's stone," Josiah began, his voice low and hesitant. "It will take 2 teams and tackle." "Then you will use 2 teams and tackle, Josiah," Charity replied, her tone brooking no argument. "I want it moved and placed squarely in the center of the courtyard. Right here," she pointed precisely at the fresh mound. "I intend to install a small fountain over that spot, commemorating Caleb's short life. It is the perfect anchor." Josiah looked at the spot, then back at Charity. His expression did not change, but a microscopic shift occurred in his posture. A slight tensing of the jaw, a fraction of a second too long in holding her gaze. He knew. He must have known. The ground beneath that spot was not stable enough for a permanent granite installation. The order was nonsensical, yet terrifyingly deliberate. Josiah turned and walked away to organize the immense effort. The moving of the stone became the focus of the entire afternoon. It was grueling, torturous work, requiring every available enslaved man to haul, winch and guide the colossal weight inch by painful inch across the scorched earth. The grinding of the stone against the ground, the shouts of exertion, the rhythmic creaking of the ropes, all served Charity's purpose perfectly, drowning out any residual sound emanating from the temporary grave. When the granite slab finally settled with a deafening, earth-shaking thud directly atop the mound, Charity felt a wave of dizzying relief. The weight of that stone was finality. It was a tombstone erected by the very people Elias had oppressed, cementing his secret demise. As the men dispersed, wiping sweat and dirt from their faces, the pattern interrupts began. The physical act of moving the massive stone, designed to ensure Charity's silence, became the catalyst for the improbable escape. Maeva watched from the kitchen window, her hands deep in bread dough. Josiah wiped down the flank of the draft horse, his attention ostensibly on the animal. But the unspoken dialogue was already running between them, flowing beneath the surface noise of the plantation. Elias was gone. The weight of the stone was proof. The chain was broken. They realized instantly that Charity, consumed by the terrible secret in the courtyard and the necessity of maintaining the lie of Elias's departure, was now dangerously distracted. Her psychological state, previously locked down by Elias's tyranny, was now volatile and focused entirely inward. She had sacrificed her husband to grief and rage, and in doing so, she had momentarily destabilized the entire power structure of Oak Ridge. This was not a time for rebellion. It was a time for calculated flight. Maeva and Josiah, along with 4 others they trusted, 2 field hands and a young laundrywoman named Elsa, began to communicate in the coded language of their shared hymns and work songs. Ailsa, whose duties included sewing and repairing the household linens, quietly began hoarding sturdy cotton fabric, cutting it into strips thick enough for binding wounds, or more crucially, for fashioning crude backpacks. Josiah, working in the stables, began slowly, deliberately sabotaging the plantation's own heavy wagons, rendering them useless for rapid pursuit, while quietly tending to the fastest remaining horse, ensuring it was well fed and ready for a single desperate journey. Their plan was intricate and hinged entirely on the fact that Charity, the sole remaining authority, would be incapable of rational action once the lie began to fray. Charity, meanwhile, retired to the parlor, staring out at the courtyard, now dominated by the ugly, silent granite slab. The heat intensified, becoming a physical presence pressing against the windows. The low thrumming from the ground had ceased entirely, smothered by the granite. Yet a new kind of sound had taken its place in her mind. The persistent, faint crunching of bones and dirt, the imagined sounds of Elias's teeth grinding down on clay as he finally succumbed to the darkness. She walked out onto the veranda again, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't name. She needed to ensure the ceiling was absolute, but the earth, despite the stone's weight, was not fully compliant. As she peered down at the base of the massive granite slab, she noticed it, a thin, dark line snaking out from beneath the stone, where the soil had been too loosely packed against the weight. It was a fissure, widening slowly in the baked clay of the courtyard. It was not caused by settling. It was caused by dampness. A low, distant thunder rumbled, a warning of the impending tempest. The summer sky, which had been a harsh, blinding blue, was curdling into a bruised, ominous purple. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling faintly of sulfur and wet earth, the smell of a coming storm that would turn the courtyard into a quagmire. Charity stared at the fissure, that tiny, dark, wet smile spreading wider in the clay. The heavy rain would saturate the fresh soil beneath the capstone, turning it into a dense, inescapable quicksand. But quicksand also yields secrets. It shifts, it exhumes. She saw Maeva and Josiah standing near the slave quarters, their silhouettes stark against the angry sky. They were not looking at her, and they were not looking at the courtyard. They were looking intently at the western horizon, where the storm promised both destruction and a sudden, violent covering of tracks. The ground was beginning to weep, and in the oppressive darkness of the approaching storm, the carefully laid plans of the enslaved people to use the sudden, brutal murder of the master as the opportunity for their own long-delayed escape were finally set into irreversible motion, perfectly timed to the moment the earth threatened to betray the mistress's darkest secret. The revelation was imminent, wrapped in thunder and mud. The courtyard stone was warm, but the earth heaped upon it was impossibly cold, slick with a dew that was not merely condensation, but the sweat of a subterranean terror. Ilara, the mistress, stood over the freshly laid granite slab, a figure carved from pale ivory and sheer, unadulterated madness. Her thin hands, still faintly smeared with the dark loam of the excavation, trembled less from exertion and more from the deep, resonant satisfaction that vibrated up from the earth below her heels. This was not a silent grave. The sound started as a dull thud, a desperate rhythmic striking against the dense clay that Ilara and the handful of enslaved hands had painstakingly tamped down. It was the sound of a living man, the master of this poisoned land, realizing that the earth had swallowed the last vestiges of his wicked reign. It was a sound that should have shattered the pre-dawn stillness of the Louisiana parish, yet the air was so thick, so heavy with humidity and fear, that the sound was strangely muted, internalized, like a heartbeat struggling against an overwhelming pressure. Cato, the oldest of the hands brought in to seal the atrocity, shifted his weight. His face, usually a mask of stoic endurance, was now etched with a horror that surpassed decades of lashings and brutality. He could feel the vibrations through the soles of his worn leather boots, a desperate telegraph of final suffering. He looked at Ilara, expecting to see remorse, or perhaps the final collapse of her sanity. Instead, he saw meticulous focus. "Press down, Cato," she commanded, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the sharp, cutting edge of absolute authority. The symmetry must be maintained. He loved order. He must rest in perfect geometric stillness. They did as they were told. They lifted the smaller stones from the perimeter, stones the master had ordered, placed just last autumn, demanding the courtyard reflect the pristine order of his ruthless mind, and dropped them, one by painful one, onto the central, largest slab. Each thwack was a hammer blow, not just sealing the tomb, but crushing the final hopes of the man beneath. The master's frantic struggle, which had been a clear, frantic scratching, now turned into a series of broken, guttural noises, muffled yells consumed by the soil. The horrifying truth, the one Ilara had withheld even from the horrified witnesses, now began to manifest. She hadn't simply buried her husband alive in a fit of grief over their starved son, little Thomas. That would have been too quick, too merciful for the man who had hoarded every spare grain, every ounce of nourishment, driven by a pathological greed tied to a hidden, complex insurance scheme involving the estate and the cessation of the legitimate lineage. A scheme he had carefully documented in ledgers hidden beneath the floorboards of his study. No, Ilara was not merely burying a body. She was ensuring the maximum duration of conscious, suffocating terror. Before dragging him, bound and gagged from his bed, she had administered a crude tincture, a compound distilled from local nightshade, and powerful, fast-acting opiates pilfered from the plantation's poorly stocked dispensary. It had been enough to paralyze the large man completely, locking him in his own skin. but crucially, it had not dulled his mind. He had been fully aware, conscious of the rough hemp biting his wrists, conscious of the chill night air on his skin, conscious of the smell of the shovel-turned earth, and conscious most exquisitely of the moment the first heavy clod of soil struck his face, sealing the light forever. Now, hours later, the paralysis was beginning to fade, giving him just enough motor control to struggle violently, to realize the true, permanent, and utterly inescapable nature of his confinement. The sounds escalated once more, sharper this time. A series of desperate, choking sounds, the air running out, the pressure of the earth settling against his ribs like an iron vise. Ilara stepped forward, ignoring the beads of sweat pouring down Cato's temples. She placed her silk slipper precisely on the central slab. "You starve my son," she whispered, not to the air but directly to the earth, her voice tight with a cold, terrifying clarity. "So you will learn the weight of hunger, the taste of cold earth, and the suffocation of the world you coveted so dearly." She began to walk slowly across the newly laid stones, her slight frame placing pressure strategically over the supposed center of the crypt. The others followed suit, a procession of the damned, walking out the sin of the living and the death of the unburied. The ground beneath their feet ceased its internal convulsions. The noise stopped, not with a gasp, but with a sudden, unnerving silence, a finality more chilling than any scream. The master was gone, consumed by the earth he believed he owned. But the horror was only just beginning to calcify. Ilara turned to Cato, her eyes vast and empty, like two dark wells reflecting the distant hazy stars. The promise of dawn was finally staining the eastern sky a bruised purple, illuminating the macabre tableau. "You saw nothing," she stated, not asking, not threatening, but declaring a fundamental truth of their shared survival. "You heard nothing. This stone has been here for years. It is stable. It is permanent." Cato met her gaze, his heart a dead thing in his chest. He knew that their complicity meant that if she was discovered, they would be implicated not just in murder, but in the calculated execution of the plantation owner, a crime that historically guaranteed the most agonizing death imaginable. But he also knew that their true survival had begun the moment the last stone settled. The master, in his living cruelty, had been a finite, predictable tyrant. The mistress, in her psychotic grief, was an unpredictable, immediate threat, yet she represented the only path out of the immediate hell. "We saw only the sunrise, mistress," Cato replied, his voice rough and low, tying his fate and the fate of the other 7 hands to her unraveling lie. Ilara smiled. It was not a smile of relief or joy, but of a terrible, quiet triumph. The satisfaction of a score settled with the ultimate payment. She moved toward the back entrance of the main house, her pace unnervingly steady. "The ledgers," she murmured, gesturing toward the study window. "The master kept meticulous records, accounts of every debt, every secret transaction, every human life treated as chattel inventory." She disappeared into the shadows for a moment, emerging clutching a heavy iron key ring, the familiar sound of the massive brass keys clinking a terrifying counterpoint to the quiet grave. She didn't return to the courtyard, but walked directly toward Cato, extending her hand. His hidden malice is sealed with him. The ledgers, however, remain. They document the true ownership of this place, the true valuation of every soul here. They must be destroyed. All of it. She dropped the keys into Cato's calloused palm. The weight was significant. This was not the keys to the pantry. This was the key to the entire operation. The heavy, official skeleton key to the master's safe, the lockbox, and the plantation house itself. "The morning patrols will begin soon," she continued, her eyes scanning the swampline, the dense, suffocating foliage that offered the only true escape. "I will be gone before the sun crests the trees. You will wait until noon. You will retrieve the ledgers. You will burn them, utterly and completely, in the hearth until only ash remains. Cato stared at the keys, a profound mixture of terror and dawning, unimaginable potential seizing him. The master had kept these men and women in check through documentation, the meticulous record of their worth, their debts, their families, and their legal status. Destroying the ledgers was not just erasing evidence of the murder. It was dissolving the legal framework of their enslavement on this specific property. "And if the authorities come looking for you, mistress?" Cato asked, testing the boundaries of this improbable, horrifying deal. Ilara turned fully toward the swamp, the low-hanging mist seeming to embrace her. "If they come, Cato, you tell them I was distraught over our child. You tell them I fled into the swamp, driven mad by grief. And you tell them that the master, having sent the child to his premature grave through his avarice, followed me in a frenzy of guilt and desperation." She pulled a small, silver-handled pistol from the voluminous folds of her dressing gown. "The swamp will hold our secrets," she said, looking down the barrel. She didn't put the pistol to her temple, but secured it inside her pocket. She intended to live, at least for a little while, among the cypress trees and the alligators, a temporary freedom bought with the life of her tyrant husband and her own shattered soul. "Do not forget the ledgers, Cato. Do not let his bureaucratic cruelty survive his burial." And with that, the mistress, the calculating, grieving murderer who had sealed her husband's fate beneath the central courtyard, walked away from the scene of her perfect crime. She did not run. She simply walked, disappearing into the dense, creeping fog that clung to the property line. She left behind not just a dead master, but an impossible choice for the living. Cato stood for a long time, the heavy keys hot in his hand, listening to the growing symphony of the morning. The chirping of unseen insects, the distant cry of a waterfowl, and the absolutely profound, horrifying silence from beneath the stones. The other slaves huddled together, watching him. They understood the situation implicitly. They were simultaneously free from their direct tyrant and bound forever to the stone that covered him. Their freedom, or at least their fragile survival, now depended on the secrecy of the central courtyard, the perfect concealment of the master's earthbound sepulchre. Cato finally moved, walking slowly toward the house. The sun was now visible, painting the scene in a harsh, bright yellow that seemed to mock the darkness of the deed. He knew what he had to do. The burning of the ledgers was paramount. It was the only way to sever the legal claim that might drag them all back into the darkness. He entered the master's study. The air inside was thick with stale cigar smoke and the faint, coppery scent of old blood, perhaps the remnants of the nightshade's struggle. He found the loose floorboard beneath the imposing oak desk, exactly where Ilara had described. Inside, bound in thick leather covers, were the records. Volume after volume of chilling documentation, every ounce of sugar harvested, every field hand purchased or sold, every financial maneuver designed to maximize profit at the cost of human life, including the morbid, cold calculations surrounding the child's slow decline. Cato pulled them out, his fingers trembling, not in fear of the documents themselves, but in recognition of the pure, distilled malice contained within. This was the true engine of the plantation, far more powerful than the whip. He carried the books, heavy as millstones, to the grand hearth in the main parlor. As he struck the match, lighting the dry kindling, he felt the weight of history. 200 years of calculated oppression stacked before him. The flames rose quickly, licking at the dry parchment. The ink began to run, the meticulous handwriting of the master curling and blackening. The smell was sharp and acrid, the smell of burning paper, burning history, and burning evidence. As the fire roared, cleansing the room of the oppressive weight of the past, Cato walked back to the courtyard one last time. He paused over the central stone. It was indistinguishable now from the surrounding granite, the earth tamped perfectly flat, blending seamlessly with the aging mortar. It looked solid, permanent, unmovable. But as he stood there watching the smoke rise from the parlor chimney, a signal of a new kind of cleansing, a chaotic, improvised freedom, Cato realized the final chilling irony. The master was dead, entombed beneath his own vanity. The mistress was gone, swallowed by the swamp, sacrificing her sanity for a spectral revenge. The ledgers, the instruments of their control, were dissolving into ash. Yet every day, every moment for the rest of their lives, the enslaved population of the plantation would have to walk across that courtyard. They would have to live, work, and sleep within feet of the spot where their tyrant lay, forever listening for the sound that would never come again, forever checking the stones to ensure the earth had not shifted. The master had starved his son to death out of pure, calculated greed. His wife had punished him with a burial of exquisite horror. But the ultimate enduring sentence was passed upon those who survived. They were tethered to the secret, perpetually guarding the silence of the earth above the man who could no longer control them, but whose presence, heavy and unmoving, would forever define their impossible escape. The price of their improvised freedom was eternal vigilance over their own necropolis. Cato turned away from the grave. The smoke was high now, dark against the burgeoning sky. He knew the authorities would come eventually. Rumors, like marsh gas, always rise. But when they arrived, they would find no records, no clear evidence, only a tale of madness, grief, and the swamp's insatiable hunger, and a courtyard, perfectly ordered, sealed, and eternally silent. If these walls could speak, they would not whisper tales of suffering, but the final, suffocating sound of earth pressing against lungs. We urge you to consider the silent graves that lie beneath the veneer of history. Look closer at the foundations of the places you inhabit.